Welcome to the Tenant Law Podcast, where we talk about new, interesting, and/or important legal cases and laws affecting New York City tenants. Today, we are talking about a new section of the Rent Stabilization Code due to take effect in 2 days on November 8th, 2023, that has to do with a rent-stabilized tenant's ability to add a domestic partner to their lease. First, let's set the stage with some context. The New York City Division of Housing and Community Renewal is the New York State agency that supervises rent stabilization. We call it the DHCR. Just like any other government agency, the DHCR has the ability to make rules, and the rules they make are called the Rent Stabilization Code. Now, a lease is a contract and a conveyance between a landlord and a tenant. Therefore, a tenant can't just call up the landlord and demand that the landlord add other people into the lease contract as tenants. This is the rule for rent stabilized apartments and free market apartments, by the way. It applies to both of them. The landlord gets to decide who it wants to do business with as long as it does not discriminate based on a protected class. So if a tenant calls up the landlord and says, "Hey, I want you to add my uncle to the lease as a tenant," the landlord does not have to do it. So that's just the general rule for rent stabilized apartments and free market apartments. However, there is an exception to that general rule for rent stabilized apartments contained in the Rent Stabilization Code. Right now, as I record this on November 6, 2023, the code is going to change in 2 days, but right now, this is how the rule goes. Rent Stabilization Code 2522.5G1 states, "The tenant shall have the right to have his or her spouse added to the lease or any renewal thereof as an additional tenant where said spouse resides in the housing accommodation as his or her primary residence." So a rent stabilized tenant can ask the landlord to add their spouse to the lease, and the landlord has to do it. Now, that law is going to be expanded in 2 days, and we are going to talk about that next. Okay, so the stage has been set. You know what the rule is now as of November 6th, 2023, but the rule is going to change. The DHCR is publishing an updated rent stabilization code on November 8th, 2023, with lots of changes. And the rule we're talking about in the first segment is changing by only a few words, but those few words will have a mighty impact. The new section, which is now going to be called Rent Stabilization Code 2522.5F1, which I will put a link to all the new rules in the show notes, states, listen carefully, "The tenant shall have the right to have his or her spouse or domestic partner added to the lease or any renewal thereof as an additional tenant where said spouse or domestic partner resides in the housing accommodation as his or her primary residence." Now, I don't see a definition of domestic partner in the Rent Stabilization Code. I really didn't expect to, because I assume it's the definition in the New York City Administrative Code at Section 3240, which defines domestic partners and sets up a system of eligibility for people registering with New York City as domestic partners. There's a whole section for this on the New York City Office of the City Clerk website, where they have the marriage stuff, they have the registration for domestic partner stuff, and I'll put a link to that also in the show notes. And on that website, they give the definition in New York of domestic partners. A domestic partnership is a legal relationship permitted under the laws of the state and city of New York for couples that have a close and committed personal relationship. And it explains everything you need to do to get your domestic partnership certificate on that website link. Now, that brings us to the takeaways that we are going to discuss for people considering putting their domestic partner or their spouse on their rent stabilized lease. These takeaways are for both people considering adding domestic partners or spouses, whoever you're going to add. But first, let's do the housekeeping. This is not legal advice. I am not your lawyer, but because I am a lawyer, this might be considered legal advertising. If it is legal advertising, it is terrible because I am asking you not to contact me. This pod is not a commercial for me or my law firm. This is simply the podcast that I always wanted to make. Email us with your question to answer on the pod. If you like our work, please give us the 5 stars and put this podcast on your socials because you might not need this information today, but somebody else might. It's time for the tenant takeaway. Tenant takeaway time. Whether you are trying to put your spouse or your domestic partner on the lease, here are 2 takeaways. The first takeaway I mentioned because it's something I get asked a lot. The landlord does have a right to ask the tenant for proof of the marriage or the domestic partnership via a marriage certificate or the domestic partnership certificate. Landlords generally dislike adding people to leases that they have not independently vetted, so you'll probably be asked for that proof. The second takeaway is more real world stuff. Okay, listen carefully. Consider carefully before placing your domestic partner or your spouse on your lease. Why do I say that? God forbid you die. As long as your spouse or domestic partner can prove that they've been living with you in the apartment as their primary residence for at least 2 years prior to your death, and that goes down to 1 year if the spouse or partner is disabled or over 62, they can succeed to your tenancy. I've done a few episodes on succession already, and I'm putting them in the show notes. I believe it's episodes 6 and 8. Now, that may require the spouse or partner to defend themselves in a court case. So I agree, the spouse or partner, they are better protected if you put them on the lease, much better protected. But right now I'm thinking about you, not them. If the marriage or the partnership goes bad and you have put the spouse or the partner on the lease, then the spouse or the partner has equal rights with you to the apartment. Now, I am not a divorce lawyer, so I have zero idea how a divorce court decides who gets the lease. But I do know from a real property point of view that once that spouse or that partner is on the lease, you're powerless to get them off. Remember what I said in the first segment. A lease is a contract and a conveyance between the landlord and the tenant. So once the other person, the spouse or the partner, becomes a tenant, then they too have a contractual right with the landlord. They have a contract with the landlord, and you can't end that contractual relationship. In other words, you can't change your mind. And I've just seen so many people so unhappy about this, where both partners in a former relationship are on a lease and it's just problematic. All I'm saying is think about it before you do it, because once it's done, it's done. However, yes, and this is important to consider as well, your partner or spouse, and therefore any minor children you have together that are in the apartment, are much better protected if the spouse or partner is on the lease. So, like everything in life, it's a decision. And there you have it. Remember, New York City, the law belongs to you, but your ownership of the law is only as great as your understanding of the law. So let's learn to live better. I am Michelle Itkowitz, and this is the Tenant Law Podcast.